morning, everyone. Welcome to the Streicker Center and to the fourth session of our Women on the Move author series. As always, sincere thanks to the Samuel I. Newhouse Foundation for the support of this series. I am Marjorie Schuster, coordinator of our literary events at the Temple Emanu-El Streicker Center. Today, I have the great pleasure of welcoming two best-selling authors who are two of my favorite authors who just happen to share a last name and are mother and daughter. The mom, Hilma Wolitzer, is the author of, we think, 14 books, and Meg Wolitzer, the daughter, is the author of about 14 or 15 books as well. One of them became the basis for the acclaimed film, The Wife, starring Glenn Close, Golden Globe winner for that film. I'm very thrilled to be in conversation with them. I have lots of questions for them, but we want to hear your questions as well. So please add them to the chat feature of Zoom, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can. It is now my pleasure to welcome Hilma Wolitzer and Meg Wolitzer. Hello, well done.
Hello.
Hello, ladies. Hello, Hilma. Hello, Meg. Thank you so much for being with us today.
A pleasure.
Good. All right. Are we ready?
Yes.
So, Hilma, I want to start a little. First of all, I'd like to show the books that we're discussing today. This is this wonderful book called Today, A Woman Went Mad in the Supermarket, which is the most wonderful title. And we'll show Meg's latest book, The Female Persuasion. We'll start a little bit with Hilma. I want to talk to you about your latest and your most wonderful book. Right in the introduction, Elizabeth Strout says, and your quote is, "I don't believe there's any such thing as an ordinary life. All lives are extraordinary," which, by the way, I think is the basis for the way both of you write, which is why I think a lot of people enjoy your book so much. They're so relatable. So, Hilma, please tell us a little bit about the background of your wonderful book and tell us.
Well, the book contains stories, some of them, one of them is 56 years old. And it also includes a very new story that I wrote in 2020 that is more autobiographical than anything I've ever written. The book came about because of my daughter, Meg, and her having read the stories while my husband and I were both in the hospital with COVID. He died of it 2 days before I was released from the hospital. And when I came home, I was grieving and not feeling well. And Meg came up with the idea of collecting these stories into a volume. And she even petitioned my agent about it. I wasn't interested at first. I was too sick and too sad. And it took a while. And then I realized that I had to do something besides grieve, and that I had to have something to look forward to. Even at 91, you need something to look forward to.
Yeah, these stories are absolutely amazing. I just couldn't put this book down. When you wrote these stories originally, well, maybe you should tell everybody what they're about.
They're about people's lives. They're about men and women. They're about marriage. They're about motherhood, and they're about relationships, and they're domestic. And when I was writing them, I was living a very domestic life. I was a housewife, raised by a housewife to be a housewife. And I did enjoy my domestic life. I liked it very much. I loved being a wife and mother, but I also felt somewhat restless and felt there had to be something else I could do. And that turned out to be writing. And the domestic experience turned out to be great literary fodder.
Right. So now we'll go to Meg a moment, and then we'll tie this all together. Meg, you have written a few of my favorite books as well. And to let you know, I think I helped the sale of The Interestings myself. I recommended it to everyone I know. But first, I want to talk a bit about your most recent novel, The Female Persuasion. Is that the book? That's the book we've included in our book sales. Can you tell us a little bit about that book, that world you created, those wonderful characters?
Sure. The Female Persuasion is about the person you might meet when you're young who sees something in you and changes your life forever. I dedicated the book to 8 women who were really kind to me when I was young. One of them, in fact, is here today, my mother. And it's about mentorship and female power, which is a subject that I've returned to again and again. It's about a young woman who goes to work for a famous feminist named Faith Frank. How's that for an alliteration? And it's about how we need to lionize certain people and then we need to see them as human. So it's also a relationship novel, and it really is set in the world of women, although there are male characters who are central to the book as well. So that kind of tells you about it.
So I think you had a very strong and capable role model as well. Did that help your writing career? Let's talk about
Yeah,
your role model.
absolutely. I've done a lot of speaking engagements over the years, and I once did one, and a woman stood up during the Q&A and said, my daughter wants to be a playwright, but I know how hard it is for anyone to make it, particularly a woman. What should I tell her? And I thought about this. I wasn't quite sure. And I said, well, is she talented? And the woman said, yes, very. And I said, is she burning to do it? And she said, absolutely. And I said, I think you should tell her that's wonderful, because the world will whittle your daughter down, but a mother never should. And my mother never did. And I think that's partly why I have written all those books today. I absolutely credit her with not sort of saying, maybe you should take the LSATs, maybe you should fall back on something that you weren't burning to do. It's a huge gamble. I mean, I have children entering the world now, and you want only the best for them, but absolutely having an in-house master of this work was very, very valuable.
Absolutely. Now, in your book, do you think it's easier? In other words, Faith, who is in, I believe, in her 60s, do you think she had a harder time? In other words, Greer is a powerful young woman. Faith probably had a harder time. And then how do you feel about, let's say, our daughters? I know you have sons, but the daughters could be your daughter's age.
Yes, it's complicated. I think that my mother's generation, which is not quite Faith's generation, but my mother's generation, I mean, my mother, well, she'll tell you herself how she really made herself from scratch. I think I had a lot more help. On the other hand, when I look at our kids' generation today, my sons are 26 and 30, the world is different. It's harder to make it. I don't know how I would answer that same question today of a woman who stood up. I mean, I would want to say the same thing, but I would probably add a caveat, because it's harder now. The world is difficult. We're in very challenging times. So I think that it's a mix. To have come of age, and to be helped along by second wave feminism as I was, meant so much to me. I was in a consciousness raising group that my friends and I began when I was in junior high school, and that's a whole other story. But to have not had any of that, to find your way kind of more blindly, as I think my mother did, to me, my hat is off to her.
Yeah, I'd like to hear about that. Of course, I've seen your interviews, but I'd like you to tell everyone a little bit about how you began, Hilma.
Well, I did not grow up in a literary household, but I did grow up with an oral tradition. And I remember lying under the kitchen table and listening to the grown-ups tell stories, and they were marvelous stories. And this was during the Great Depression, but there was so much laughter. And it was a 3-generation household. So I saw the coming attractions of life as well as the family history. I heard everything. And I think that was the beginning of narrative for me. Even before I learned how to read, I heard stories and realized how valuable they were.
Did you write as a child?
Yes, I wrote very bad poetry as a child. And there was an after-school program called the Junior Inspectors Club, which was sponsored by the Department of Sanitation, of all things. And they had a mimeograph publication called The Junior Inspector, in which my first poem was published. And my mother and I got to go down to the Department of Sanitation, and a man stood up from behind a desk and shook my hand and gave me a certificate. And it was absolutely thrilling. When we walked down the street afterwards, the streets were lined with garbage trucks. It could have been West Point with crossed swords. It seemed so important and wonderful. But even though my parents did not discourage me from writing poems or anything else, they didn't encourage me until something really wonderful happened. My mother went for a parent-teacher conference. I think it was my 4th grade teacher named Miss Fredericks. And she came home glowing, and she said to my father, "You can't believe what Miss Fredericks said." She said, "Hilma shows great promise." And after that, they took my awful poems more seriously. But then about 50 years later, when I was a published writer and I was giving a reading at a library in New Jersey, a very little, very old woman stood up and said, "You don't remember me, but I was your 4th grade teacher, Miss Fredericks." And I just gushed because I felt she had transformed me by giving me this encouragement. And I said, "Oh, Miss Fredericks, I can't thank you enough for telling my mother that I showed great promise." And she said, "Oh, honey, I told that to all the mothers," which really put me in my place.
But that's okay. She started you on your path.
She did indeed.
Well, I will just say on my second grade report card, it said Marjorie is an avid reader. I always remembered that. Maybe everybody was told that. Who knows?
No, not really.
Did you encourage Meg and your other daughter to follow in your footsteps, or Meg just had talent?
Well, they both had talent. I started out as a visual artist, and my daughter Nancy is a very fine visual artist. And it's just wonderful when your children take up the work that you do. It's very flattering and it's exciting. People say the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I feel my apples have flown up from the tree and they've taken wing, and they're wonderfully talented young women. They both had talent, and I think I encouraged it, but I think they would have done it even without me. Meg can speak to that.
Meg, what do you think about that?
Well, I can't know, but I would think so, because yes, like you, and probably like everyone even watching today, I love to read. Reading was the biggest thing. And in fact, because my mother was a writer, at the library, they would let us take out as many books as we wanted. And I felt so important. I felt like we were kind of like a version of the Kennedys swanning around Hyannisport as I carried my big stack of books. Like everybody, wanted that, so cool. I love to read. I had a teacher, also an important teacher in first grade, Miss Gerby, who used to invite me up to her desk to dictate stories to her that she would write down. I sort of felt like I was an executive and she was my secretary. Take a letter, Miss Gerby, and she wrote these stories down for me, and they too were terrible, but it wasn't, I think what mattered is that when you're young, it's not about, how good are you? It's about being excited about something. And I think that that's really what I, care about. And I felt that excitement, and I probably would have felt it with or without such a talented mother.
So Hilma, tell us about you. I know you became a housewife, which I guess was expected. You had young daughters. And when did you start writing at home?
I actually started writing seriously when my children were in school. I was in my mid-30s, and I had a stroke of great fortune. I wrote a short story. I showed it to my husband, and I asked him, "Do you think this is a short story?" And he said, "Why don't you show it to Sydney?" And Sydney was someone we knew who was an artist and an art critic, and we trusted his judgment. And I sent him the story, and he liked it very much. And he put the story in his pocket and went to a party where he met Steinbeck's agent and gave her my story. And she called me the next day and said, "I'd like to represent you." And I felt, well, I have an agent. I must be a writer. I actually went into the bathroom and tried on scarves to see if I looked any different. It was very thrilling. And she finally sold that first short story to the Saturday Evening Post, which I have to say that publication gave it authority. My parents, who still didn't really pay too much attention to the fact that I was writing, was a sort of a harmless hobby that I had. When I called to say that the story had been published, before that, they would call me in stereo, my mother and father. And if my mother said, "What did you do today?" and I said, "I wrote a short story," she would then say, "Well, did the sheets come from Macy's yet?" And it was as if I hadn't said anything. But when I sold the story and called them, my father said, "Oh my goodness, the Saturday Evening Post, I read that at the dentist." And that gave it such authority.
Which story was that? Is it one that you've included in the new book?
It's the title story.
Oh, well, I'd like to talk about that title story, which is called "Today a Woman Goes Mad in the Supermarket." And first of all, how did you get the title? And tell us a little bit about that story.
Well, the title was actually the first sentence of the story, and I just moved it up. And when my publisher decided to publish this book, I really worried that the words wouldn't even fit on the cover along with my mouthful of a name, but they did a beautiful job of it, I think. And the title is both literal and metaphorical. A woman actually does have a nervous breakdown in the aisle of a supermarket, but I think it also represents the restlessness that so many women felt in the mid-20th century about their domestic lives and how they wanted something else. And it was, as Meg said, the second wave of feminism, which really helped me along tremendously. It gave me permission to do what I was doing, as did certain writers. I mean, when I read Jane Austen, I realized that you can write about domestic life and that it had validity. And when I read Grace Paley, another writer I love very much, The Little Disturbances of Men, I feel I had permission to write in a neighborhood voice in my Brooklyn accent. And
Well, a lot of your characters, they seem to be Jewish New Yorkers. Maybe both of you, actually. Maybe not specifically. Is that accurate in a lot? I guess both of you.
Definitely. And in fact, when I was lying under the kitchen table as a child and listening to the conversations, they were in English, broken English, Yiddish, and Pig Latin. And I quickly picked up a lot of Yiddish and Pig Latin because I really wanted to hear what they were saying that they didn't want me to hear.
Very, very interesting. So Meg, well, we talked a little bit about the female persuasion. Can we talk a little bit about some of your other books? I'm sure everybody would like to know about the two behind you, which most probably have seen, The Wife, and
This is My Life.
I remember very well.
Sure. So yeah, this is my little, I finally have an office in my home and I have a wall of movie posters, which is, fun to have. Yeah, so I had both of these books made into films, and This Is My Life was the first film that Nora Ephron ever directed. And in fact, she's among my list of women to be thanked at the beginning of the female persuasion, women who were so encouraging to me when I was younger. So this is the first, she had written films before, Silkwood and When Harry Met Sally, and this was this was her directing debut. And years later, I met Tom Hanks, and he said that something like that, one of the reasons that he chose to do Sleepless in Seattle was because he had seen this film and really liked it so much. And that meant a lot to me. So that was a great experience, having a writer I admired and became, good friends with, direct and co-write the script with her sister, Delia Ephron, who remains a friend to this day. That was very exciting. It takes forever to get these things made. And particularly in the case of The Wife, right beside it, it took 14 years to get that movie made. It was published as a novel in 2003 and came out, it premiered at the Toronto Film Festival, its international premiere in 2017. And that was in part because it was really hard to get a man, which is they really needed, to be willing to play a total jerk in a movie called The Wife. So not only to be kind of a boor, but to be overshadowed by the woman. But and the writer, Jane Anderson, who in fact wrote Olive Kitteridge based on, there's like 5 writers in the world or something, but she wrote the introduction to my mom's stories. And Jane Anderson wrote and won the Emmy for her HBO version of Olive Kitteridge that Elizabeth Strout wrote. I saw the way filmmakers, you have to fight for things because there's so much money involved. When I write a novel with a little luck, it won't take 14 years to get published.
That was an excellent movie.
Oh, thanks. It was a great, it's for me, having movies made, is the icing on the cake. Getting to, become friends with Glenn Close as well is lovely and wonderful, and I admire her so much. But to see, I wrote an essay actually for the Times about how the book was so much about the character's voice, kind of pissed off, funny voice. But the film, it's about her face. It's a Swedish directed film, and she keeps so much in, and you want to know what's behind there. So I had such good conversations with her about the difference between the way an actor approaches character and the way a writer does. I learned a lot from that.
Were you on the set at all? Did they like?
No, I didn't go to the set this time. I've been to sets of things that I, have been made of my work. And I always feel like they're really nice to you, but they have to kind of have somebody to sort of be your minder, to take you to craft services, give you something to eat. I just let it happen. It was not happening here. I just let it happen. And then I certainly did a lot afterward. I did an onstage conversation at the New York Times with Glenn Close and all kinds of stuff like that.
Okay. Well, we'll flip back to that in a moment. But Hilma, I want to talk a little bit about you. You started as a young mother, published a book. I understand then you started teaching writing. But you went to NYU and then you started teaching writing. Is that accurate?
Well, I didn't graduate from college, and therefore it was shocking to me that I was approached to teach in the advanced writing programs in both at Columbia University, NYU, the Iowa Writers Workshop, Bread Loaf. And I realized that I could teach, that you didn't need a formal education to learn how to teach, that I learned it by taking a workshop where I was called upon to read my work aloud, and somebody was asked to criticize it or to make comments about it. And he said that was the worst, most boring thing I've ever heard. And I was horrified, I was devastated, and I collapsed into my seat. But the teacher, who was Anatole Bourriard, who later became a book reviewer for the New York Times, became a daily book reviewer, said to my critic, you may not like her story, and you may say so, but you also have a responsibility to say why you don't like her story and how you might make it better. And in that moment, I learned how to teach and how to revise, and how important honesty and charity were in doing that. And though Meg doesn't like me to tell stories from her childhood, I have to tell this one. She started writing very young. I was a late bloomer. She was a very early bloomer, and she was good. She didn't really write bad stories when she was a child. They were very good for her age and very precocious. And when she was 11, she showed me a story, and I kept praising her. And she finally became very annoyed with me and said, you just like everything you love everything I do, in a sort of accusatory manner. And I said, well, then I'm not treating her with respect. She really wants to be treated as an equal, as a writer. So I became more critical, whereupon she burst into tears. So again, I had to find that balance between honesty and charity. And what that really means is that you can't lie about the work. You can't praise work that doesn't work. You have to suggest why it might be better, but you also have to be aware of the person behind the work. So in a workshop, nobody should feel attacked. They should feel encouraged to revise.
That does make a lot of sense. So you basically had different upbringings because nobody really encouraged you to be a writer, and apparently Meg had some early promise, and it was a different time. And did you go to college for writing, I suppose, journalism?
I was an English major, and I took a lot of writing workshops. I started off at Smith, and I transferred to Brown because they would let me take more writing classes toward the English major. But along the way, I studied with John Irving and Mary Gordon and John Hawkes, who really all, were very good teachers and very good mentors. And I think that when you're beginning, you're so alone as a writer. And if some of the people out there are trying to write or and feel just sort of tentative about it, I always say to people, find one person that you might consider a designated reader, one person who you share a taste in books, perhaps you talk about books together, but also wishes you well. And maybe kind of slip them your work on the side a little bit, because it's very hard. You're by yourself. Back then, those workshops for both my mom and for me meant the world. Right now, I run a program actually at Stony Brook. This year it's been virtual, called Bookends, and it's a 1-year novel intensive. And we help people take manuscripts that are good and sort of make them really, really good, make them better and go out into the world. And it's such a joy to see the ways in which community can really, really help a writer.
Well, speaking of that, how about the two of you? Are you each other's first readers? Do you critique each other?
Yes, we do. And nobody cries. We take each other very seriously. We don't have a secret agenda. That's really important. If your first reader is your mother, she may just love everything you do. If your first reader is your husband and he doesn't like something, he realizes he's never going to get to sleep that night because you're going to keep asking him why he didn't like it, and didn't he like it did he hate it, and so forth and so on. And so having some peers who don't have a secret agenda, either in a workshop or, as Meg and I are lucky enough to have each other. And we not only share work, but we share talk about writing, books we love. Every night we do a cryptic puzzle together from the British Guardian. I think it's keeping my brain oiled at my age, and it's really lots of fun. And it also reflects us as writers in a strange way. I guess words when there are just 2 letters in say a 12-letter word. I can just guess it. And I don't even know why. It's sort of intuitive. Meg is very analytical. She figures it out. And I think this is the way we write in a way. I sort of write intuitively and in a hurry, and Meg is slower and more deliberate and more analytical. And it's reflected in the way we do the puzzle. Don't you think so, Meg?
Yes, that's good. But that's very analytical of you, Mother. So there you go.
Oh, there you are.
Another thing,
very intuitive of you, Meg.
Sharing each other's work. Neither of us can be said to be precocious anymore, I'm afraid. That's different now. That's really different. Look, I feel like the luckiest person around to have my secret weapon here, my mother, to show my work to, and to have been so supportive, because that's not the ordinary situation. It isn't. And I'd like to offer her to all of you here today. Call her in the middle of the night with your stories. No, I kid. No, but it's absolutely, it remains a real pleasure, because I think that there's some things that, like, I know she's right. Like, with writing, with language, that's what we're talking about, really, language. We both love language. Like, if I see a number, I'm frightened. I have to run away. But words, playing with letters and words, we're both big Scrabble players. I know that she's right about something, because you develop an ear. When you do it for so long, you hear language. And one thing that also helps, I think, is to say you're writing out loud. We both feel that way. You can hear when something's just kind of a clunker, and you can hear when something is what you meant to do. So I'm incredibly lucky having her as an early reader. Absolutely.
I feel lucky too.
I'd like to talk about your stories. I really like to delve into those characters of Paulette and Howard. I, of course, read your book several times. Do you think it's just a snapshot to earlier times, but or it just stands alone today? In other words, they were in the 50s, a young couple.
They're sort of like friends who have moved out of the neighborhood. And every once in a while, I wonder what happened to them. And so I would write a story about them. And then I didn't write any short stories. I wrote some novels, but not any short stories. And then I didn't write any fiction for a while. And after Meg encouraged me to publish this collection, I realized that I needed to bring them up to the present time. And even though I protected my privacy, my family's privacy, and that of my friends by not writing directly about them, I felt for once I had to use more of my own actual experience in a story, because my husband had just died and because we had both had COVID. But also, it's not just a COVID story, it's a story of a long marriage. And I put in some details that are true and some that are invented, because I'm a fiction writer. And I think of it as truth wrapped in a lie. And in the end, it was painful to write, but it was cathartic to write. I felt I would have been more unhappy if I hadn't written the story. I mean, after COVID, when someone dies of COVID, there are none of the usual rituals of mourning. Nobody sits shiva, there's no funeral, nobody comes and puts their arms around you, you can't be with your children. And it's as if the person had vanished. And that's what I tried to convey in the story, a disappearance. And So it seems surreal. And writing about it made it real and led me toward acceptance. And we finally had a Zoom memorial service for my husband, one ritual, a year to the day after he died. And by then, I think the story had really helped me to get to that point. I wasn't able to even prepare for the Zoom memorial until after that was written.
Well, how did you manage initially? Right, I guess this happened at the beginning of COVID. How did you manage initially? You went home by yourself?
Yes, it was very difficult. We were in different hospitals. We were in separate hospitals. We both went by ambulance. He went first, and I never even said goodbye to him. I never kissed him. I never said I loved him, nothing. The EMT guys were running down the hall with him, and I was running after him with his cell phone and the charger and a pair of pajamas that didn't match. And I realized after the elevator door closed, I hadn't said the things I should have said. And then we were in hospital, and then we spoke to each other on the phone. But he was clearly getting worse and worse, requiring more and more oxygen. It was a lovely young doctor who called me and my children every night to report on his lack of progress, unfortunately. And then 2 days after he died, I was released from the hospital. And I came home, and there were his shoes next to the bed, one of his many pair of drugstore eyeglasses on the bed. And for a very long time, I had all his clothing as well, until I would say until my grandsons could become vaccinated, double vaccinated, and come over and help me both physically and emotionally with gathering up all that stuff, putting it into huge trash bags and donating it somewhere. And they did all that and helped me out. And it was just wonderful to be with them again. I mean, we haven't resumed what I consider normal life, but there are certain aspects of it that have returned, for which I'm very grateful. And both of my daughters, their spouses, and my grandchildren helped me tremendously, even from a safe distance. They were a tremendous help to me.
So during that time, you couldn't have like the normal rituals of mourning, Shiva.
No, exactly, none of them. And it was really strange. As I said, it seemed, when I call it the Great Escape, I compare it to Houdini escaping, a magician's assistant disappearing through a trapdoor. I couldn't quite accept that he had died. I mean, we were married for 68 years, and that's a great blessing. And I do appreciate that we had a very long time together. It was the circumstances of his death that were more difficult to take.
My father also passed away a year ago, not during COVID, not from COVID. So I know a little about what you're speaking about, because my mother had a bit of a similar thing with no Shiva, etc. It made it.
I'm so sorry to hear that.
But it added another layer to how difficult it became for everybody, for the family. So yeah, so that I think could be one reason why your book really grabbed me, and your last chapter, and the long marriage. You know, it was very, very beautiful, very beautifully done.
Thank you.
I hope you're doing well now, and you're able to.
I am. How's your mother doing?
Yeah, better. It's about a year, so
Good.
finally better. Yeah, she's watching, I assume. So on another note, can we talk a little bit about one of Meg's other books, which was my favorite, and it was called The Interestings, and it talked about 6 teenagers who went over to camp. And again, I felt like I might have been a character in that, because it's pretty much in my age group and some of my experiences. Did you have those experiences as well?
Yes. In fact, I went to a summer camp the summer I was 15 that, you know, I like to say changed my life. It's an easy phrase, but it is true in so many ways, because it's the summer that I kind of found like my cohort in a way for the first time. And I really met a group of kids, some of whom lived in New York City. And I didn't know anyone who lived in New York City. I would go into New York City, meet my boyfriend there. He lived in Merrick. I lived in Syosset. We would meet at Penn Station and go to Washington Square Park and go to the auto pub, if anybody remembers that place in the General Motors building where you ate in the car and you watched cartoons on the wall. It was like an indoor drive-in, and then go home. But these were kids who lived in the city and went to schools I'd never heard of called Dalton, places where my kids, would end up going many years later. It was a different world. And I was sort of excited by these kids who were interested in the arts in a way that I was, but I didn't have the language for it yet. I just knew what I loved. And, it was mostly writing. And I spent a summer being a really bad actress. And I had one voice that every play I was in, it could be a Neil Simon play or, Eugene O'Neill. And I would be like, "Mother, where are you? Where are you, mother?" It's what I call my Katharine Hepburn voice. So I couldn't be an actress. That wasn't going to happen. But I loved being in plays. I was in plays in school. And I met a girl there named Martha, who became my best friend and is my best friend to this day. And we talk endlessly and bore everyone in our midst, our husbands. Her husband actually is Adam Gopnik, the writer, who's, so it's like in a literary world, it just sort of expanded in that way. We met again as adults. There was a 12-year period she lived in Canada where we didn't know each other, we didn't see each other, and we picked up pretty much where we'd left off. And that friendship has been really, so important to me. And I dedicated the book to my parents and to Martha Parker, who I met there. But the place, again, I think the word permission, my mom mentioned it earlier. And I think that people who give you permission, my friend, the writer Sherry Fitch, a Canadian writer, calls them permissionaries. And I think they are. They give you permission to try something that maybe you're not good at, but because you love it and you're meeting other people who feel the same way. That was the summer that started for me. So I became a writer. I sold my first novel when I was in college at Brown. But it didn't occur to me to write the interestings until deep in middle age. I mean, Martha and I had been talking endlessly about our camp experiences at Indian Hill. It no longer exists. It was called a performing arts workshop. They didn't even call it camp. It was quite serious about all the performing arts. But I realized when I finally had the idea to write it, it wasn't about writing about a group of friends. It was about what happens to talent over time. And it was about envy that you might feel even for people you love. And these were themes that I couldn't have known until I myself was in middle age. And then I just was like, wow, I couldn't wait to write it and return to what I cared about. I mean, Mary Gordon, one of my teachers, who's a dear friend to this day, said to our class, only write about what's important. And I think what that makes you think as a writer is, what is important? By which she means, what's important to me? And those were things that I was thinking about anyway. Write the things you would be thinking about anyway, even if nobody was going to pay you to write them.
Well, when everybody's 15, it's all ahead of them. You don't know who's going to be fantastic. They all have the same, more or less, opportunities, right?
No, and a lot of it is really about luck. I don't know if some of our audience today has seen any of the Michael Apted films, 7 Up, 28 Up. They're incredible. They're streaming. And he followed a group of British school children when they were 7 years old, and he filmed them every 7 years. The most recent and last one, because the director, Michael Apted, died, was 63 Up. And so much of it, I realize, is about class and luck and what happens to you along your life that make, you think your life is going to go one way. And then something happens, a parent dies, or, your family comes into money, or you lose all your money. And no life is a straight road. And I wanted to kind of write about that in The Interesting. So it was while it's not autobiographical, it's a very personal book for me.
But I noticed you wrote finally a very strong male character.
Yes.
Ethan. And you generally, both of you, I believe, write from the female point of view.
I do, but I feel the men are very important to the women's lives, as they are in my life as well. I happen to like men a lot. I think that women have made great progress, but that we still have a long way to go in terms of equality.
So Meg, that brings us, let's talk about your article that was just republished in the Times. It's called Second Shelf. Is that correct? And it's a funny play on words because the second sex. How are female authors taken as seriously as men?
Well, the article The article came out in 2012, and the New York Times just had its 125th, the book review had its 125th birthday, and they reprinted the article, which had gotten a lot of attention at the time. It's hard to track. Certainly things feel different, but I agree with my mother that there are a lot of things, there's institutionalized sexism in all kinds of ways, but certainly in some respects, women have won more prizes and have been taken more seriously that way. But when I was coming of age as a writer, I opened the essay with an anecdote, something that happened in my life. I met a man at a party, and he asked me, heard I was a writer, and asked that terrible question that all writers dread, which is, would I have heard of you? And I've thought about it a lot over time, and I thought there's only really one good answer, which is in a more just world. Mm-hmm. But I started to kind of name my books, and he, no response, and, eyes rolling up in his head. And finally, when he asked me what they were about, and I said, I write about marriage, I write about the inner life, I write about the lives of women, I write about, power and whatever I said. And he kind of said, oh, you should talk to my wife. She'd be interested in that. There's this sense that these themes are somehow female. So I reject that notion. I always feel what a novel is a way into someone else's life. Every novel is kind of an advent calendar with a lot of ways in, a lot of little windows or doors that you can open. But one of the reasons I think a character like Olive Kitteridge, that book became so, it's so beautifully written and it's so funny. And humor, by the way, just unrelatedly, is something my mother and I really share a lot. I think we have a similar sense of humor, and it shows up in our work. But I feel like, don't you want to get a little window into how someone else lives, how someone else feels? That's something that is found in fiction, and men and women can embrace it. And yes, I think things are better in some ways, but I don't have the numbers on it. In other ways, you can find yourself sort of dissed in some way in a review that you think a man might not have, been asked the same questions or treated in the same way. It's an ongoing thing, absolutely.
And the covers of the books, I believe you mentioned that even the book covers are slightly different.
Well, yeah, one of the things I talked about in the essay, The Second Shelf, was the different ways that books by men and women looked at the time. And sometimes you would have a book with what I jokingly called Little Girl in a Field of Wheat on a book by a woman, an illustration, or sort of secondarily something I call Women in Water, a kind of dreamy book. And then you have books by men that were like all typeface, that said to the reader, this book is an event. And why, I think books are for everyone. They should just be beautiful and exciting and draw anyone in. It may very well be true that women read more fiction than men, and there have been studies that have shown that. I don't know what the numbers are, but some author friends were saying that they were asking their publishers to make their books look a little stronger. It's not like I want my books to look like a male book. I don't feel that there is a gendered thing around it, just the way it's been treated. I think books should reflect what's inside them. If your book is about a little girl who lives in a field of wheat, by all means. But sometimes those books were not, in fact, that. It's just about making the playing field equal, giving everybody a chance to say, this book looks good. Let me read it and take it on its own terms.
Well, so would you write about a male character? Both of you, actually. Have you ever had a male?
I wrote my first male character in a novel for children. And it was a first-person male character. He was 13 years old. And I wrote a first draft of it while I was away at an artist colony. And I immediately sent it to my editor, who said, I love this book. There's only one problem. This 13-year-old boy sounds like a 50-year-old woman. And I realized that it had to do with the way he spoke and the way he thought. And I actually hung around with some more children after a while and listened to them and understood that if a kid is running away from home, he's not going to say on the eve of my departure. He's going to say the night before I split. And that you really have to listen to the way people sound. And reading your work aloud is, as Meg said, is a wonderful way of doing it. you listen for the musicality, and you also listen for the truthfulness of what you're saying. Are you trying to show off, or you're trying to tell a story? And you really hear that when you read it aloud.
That's interesting.
And Meg has said that when she gives readings sometimes at bookstores, she crosses things out. Well, I'm an endless reviser. I would go into bookstores and cross them out from the shelves if I could. I'd go in with a red pen if anybody would let me. And you finally do have to let go.
Well, are you working on anything now? I'm sure both of you are.
I am going to continue with Paulette. I've made her slightly younger than I am. She's not quite 90. I'm heading toward 92. But I'm thinking that she's in similar circumstances. Her husband has just died. She lives alone. Her children are concerned about her. I live quite independently. But perhaps she is having some failures, and her children are worried about her living alone and are urging her to go into assisted living. I mean, this is something that hovers over all people of my age at this point, and I'm really concerned about it. And I don't know what would happen. I never know what's going to happen when I write something, and that is quite dangerous. It's perilous, really. I start with a sentence and I either keep going or I don't keep going. And Joseph Heller wrote his book, Something Happened, and I always feel I'm going to have a book called Nothing Happened, because
I'd read it.
I might get rid of 150 pages.
I'm
sorry, Meg, what were you going to say?
I said I'd read it. If I don't know what has to happen in a book. I mean, it's so much about the voice, and the voice in your stories is just so funny and sexy and, sometimes reckless and interesting to me.
It seems so strange to me now looking back, because I was rather shy and rather conventional. And then suddenly I was writing what were considered rather brazen stories for the times. And maybe this is why they've held up, because I was not speaking from my conservative, frightened little self. I was speaking from some inner self that wanted to break out. And so she was louder and brassier and funnier and sexier.
So we have a lot of very interesting questions. Some of them have been answered, but Elise would like to know, she saw one episode of The Interestings on TV, then it ended. What happened? She loved that book.
Oh, thank you, Elise. They made a pilot, Amazon made a pilot, and it didn't get picked up as a series, which was very sad. Again, as I've said, but the movie and TV side of things is always the icing on the cake. But yes, they did just a pilot, and that was the end of it, unfortunately.
All right. Well, let's see. Rachel would like to know, what, of course, do you read? Both of you, what did you read growing up? And how does that influence your style? Let's start with Hilma.
Well, as I said, I didn't have a literary household. We had an ancient set of encyclopedia, which I think I read alphabetically, slowly. And we also had Dr. Morris Fishbine's home medical advisor. So I became a hypochondriac way before I became a writer. But I did have access to the library. And one of the books that I read was called Hitty, Her First 100 Years. It was a novel about a doll, and it was written by Rachel Field, and I believe it actually was published the year before I was born. And when I say I was writing poetry, I was also secretly writing a novel and several notebooks, and it was completely plagiarized. It was the first 100 years of a woman's life. And I think her name might have been Kitty. It might have been something very close. But that was a big influence for me. And I realized you don't borrow or steal from other writers, not consciously anyway.
I read, the first book I ever cried at, we read together, was Charlotte's Web. And the idea that you could cry over the death of a spider, not even a person, meant that that if a writer does it well, if the writer believes it, the reader can believe it too. And you bring these characters to life, whether they are arachnids or pigs or human. And I think that sense of character was so important to me, and it remains so important to me now. My reading is pretty vast. I read all kinds of things, read student work. I'm reading the new Sally Rooney now. I've, read Britt Bennett, all kinds of writers. I love to read new and old. It's a pleasure to return to a book. I think particularly during uncertain times, to return to a book that you once loved, because it's still there. Like Willa Cather, her writing it's so beautiful and somehow comforting to me. My Antonia, a book I loved when I was young. But one funny thing is that you read a book at a different age and you have a different reaction to it because you're a different person.
That's true. And because I didn't go to college, I began reading the classics late in life. And Meg said, "Oh, that's wonderful, Mom, because you have a more mature attitude and you come to it with more experience." But I think I would have liked a guided tour when I was younger. And I think I missed out on something. And I may never catch up. But I still love to read Virginia Woolf. I love to reread her, not just A Room of One's Own, which I finally got. When the kids were small and I began writing, my husband was a psychologist. And we were two typewriter families. We had two standard typewriters, which we had at either end of the kitchen table. He was typing his patient reports and I was typing a story, and the children were running around and the dog was barking. And I didn't realize I needed this quiet. I later on became quite neurotic about it and had that quiet. But then you get what you wish for. And now except for the hammering and drilling that goes on in the apartment next door, because I live in a high rise in Manhattan, it's pretty quiet around here. I do miss my husband putting on some jazz in the background. And also I miss his company, and also he was a wonderful resource for me. He was like a walking thesaurus. If I couldn't find a particular word, he could. And because he knew so much about music and psychology, I could also consult him for certain facts, which were very useful. And now, there's nobody to ask. I have to figure a lot out myself that I didn't have to. But I still have books, and reading the books are wonderful. I particularly love the essays of a British writer named Jenny Diskey. Her title, I can't even remember it right now, but it's longer than my title. And they're funny, they're honest, they're outrageous. And I've also been reading Rachel Cusk, who I admire very much. And she's taken some real risks in her writing, which I appreciate. She writes about motherhood with some ambivalence, which a lot of people have objected to, but it's truly honest. And what I look for in a book is what I hope people look for in my books, is I hope they read it for pleasure, for consolation, and to be informed, and also for that shock of recognition. Even though it takes place in another century or another country, you recognize the experience that character is having and you relate to it. And that's a wonderful feeling when you're reading.
That is, because you're both of you write such character-driven books that people relate to your characters completely. I mean, that's all these comments that keep coming in. Actually, I'm just wondering, there was an interesting article in Hadassah magazine a few months back. I don't know if either of you saw it, but a lot of authors and readers were asked for their most important Jewish character. And a lot of people went to Marjorie Morningstar, a lot. By the way, both of your names were in, you should Google the article or I'll send it to you. Both of your names are mentioned. But a lot of people went to Marjorie Morningstar as a Jewish character that all women seem to relate to.
I don't think that she would be for me. I'm thinking of some of the characters in Roth, of course, who don't always come across that well. I actually met him. I was giving a reading at UPenn, and my host had taken me to the train station, and there was Philip Roth. And he said, "Would you like to meet him?" And I said, "Sure." And he introduced us, and Roth asked if I'd like to sit with him for the trip. And of course I did, and it was practically an interview. And one of the things he said, speaking of Jewish characters and Jewish life, was that he was invited by his father's synagogue to come and speak. And he was his father was just absolutely thrilled and so proud of him. Portnoy's complaint had just come out. And he said he was up on the bema and he was attacked by every other member of the congregation. They called him an anti-Semite. He said, I just wanted to go to sleep. He said, I wanted to disappear. He felt so sorry for his father. Not sorry that he wrote the book, but sorry for this reception in front of his father.
Wow. Tell us a little bit, a lot of people would like to know, tell us a little bit about your writing process, your writing day. What is the day of a writer like?
I think, is this the lightning round? Shall we give short answers so we can get in a few more questions? Let's see. I think for many writers, myself included, the early part of the day is the best. It's like before the blood sugar drops in that afternoon stupor state. I get up, I live on the Upper West Side, I walk the dog, often go to Riverside Park. I'm already thinking about my work. I like the physicality of getting out of the house and thinking about work. And then I get home and really get going. But I'm a big believer of not pushing it too hard. Sometimes you need to read something that the writer was excited about when they were writing, and don't beat up on yourself if you have a bad writing day. But I try to keep the day pretty inviolable, and at night watch British TV shows with my husband, British mysteries. But during the day, try to really, really work and think.
I get up in the morning, and Amy Tan refers to it as going from dream to dream. I get up and stagger from the bed to the computer because I don't know whether I've been dreaming the story, thinking about it in my sleep, but I start writing immediately. And the next thing I know, it's dark out. And it's very convenient because I can then go to bed and I'm still in my pajamas. I haven't changed at all. And the wonderful thing about that experience of being so immersed in a fictional universe, in a parallel universe, is that you forget who you are. And particularly, I forget how old I am until I pass a mirror. And that's really shocking because you are living through the characters. And my characters are of all ages.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing what happens to Paulette next and how she proceeds in her life. That would be very interesting.
Me too, thank you.
Yes. Now, this has been a wonderful discussion. And Erica, this is the final comment. She said she so much enjoyed this discussion and she wants to take a moment to offer condolences on the loss of your husband and father, and may his memory always be a blessing and a comfort.
Thank you so much, Erica. I appreciate that.
A nice ending. I can't thank you enough for both of you for being with us. I hope that we can entice you to come in person. I think we're only across the park from where both of you are. So maybe in the spring, things will change and you'll come visit us in person. And thank you very much for being with us.
Oh, thank you
for having us.
Total pleasure. Thank you.